Well, hello, Current World Issues class. Today, we are going to start some notes on the death penalty. And I know that your big decision at the end of this unit is to decide what you think about the death penalty. Do you believe in it? Do you not believe in it? And I think it's really important, if we want the death penalty or don't, that we need to know the facts. We need to know how these methods are used and how they actually kill the person that's being executed. So we're going to go into some gory details a little bit, but I think it's important to understand kind of how it happens and whether you think it's important. Okay, so here we go. All right, first of all, I want to take a look at some statistics, and let's take a look at what's going on when we compare ourselves in the United States to the rest of the world. So you'll notice that this was done in 2008, I believe. You'll see more people were executed in Asia than in any other part in the world. And this is done by Amnesty International, who, by the way, is an anti-death penalty group. So just understand that that's going to be their bias. If you look at the yellow countries here on the map, those are the 25 countries that carried out executions in 2008. So 25 countries out of the world carry out executions. Now, if you look at the top 5, what do you notice is number 1? Yeah, China. And actually, according to these statistics, they had 1,718, but we honestly don't know exactly how many are happening in China. They don't like to give out those numbers. So that would be an estimate. Second then would be Iran with 346. Third would be Saudi Arabia with 102. And then the US and Pakistan are a close 4th and 5th. Right? Now, as we look at that, I want you to think about, do we see ourselves similar to the other countries that we just pointed out, like Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China? Just think about that. Are we like those countries? Okay, so you say that they're more like third world type countries, maybe not as developed as us. Some people might say that. Okay. Notice, by the way, that we don't have any other countries in South America, Central America, or North America that have the death penalty. We are the only ones. If you look in Europe, there's only one little tiny country that has the death penalty. So to most Europeans, United States people are seen as kind of barbaric, that we would use something so old-fashioned. Okay, just so you're aware of that. Now, if you look at the statistics down on the bottom here, let me move my little rectangle. 59 countries still use the death penalty. 138 do not. At least 8,864 have been sentenced to death in 52 countries in the year 2008. And at least 2,390 people were executed in those 25 countries listed. So obviously there's 59 countries that have the death penalty, but in 2008, only 25 of them actually used it. And you'll find that that's true. There are countries that believe in the death penalty, but they don't necessarily execute anybody in that particular year. Now you ask, let's take a look in more depth at the rest of the world. So this is results as of 2012. And I love this because it really kind of clarifies some things. So if you look at the blue bubbles, that represents the number of death sentences handed down. So, for example, Nigeria, right here, had 56 death sentences handed down through the courts. If you look at the red dots represent the number of executions. So let's look at the US. So, for example, they had 77 death sentences handed down. We had 43 executions within the year 2012. So Nigeria, the one we just used before, had no actual executions in that particular year. So, and it also does these bubbles by size or group. So you can really see in this example that China is huge, right? Number of death sentences handed down is actually very small. You'll notice all they have is a plus. And if you see a plus here on some of these, that means that those are the only ones that we know of that have been reported. But as I told you before, China has thousands, and they really will not give us that information. But what I find interesting about China, typically you have more blue than you have red. You have more death sentences than you have executions. But in China, it is the reverse. They pretty much execute, but then again, we don't know how many death sentences have been handed down, but there's not much time between those two things. Iran has 314 death sentences, and notice it is the second highest number. Most are for drug-related crimes in Iran, and they actually executed, they had 314 executed. They had 79 sentences handed down plus. Okay, sorry, I screwed that up. Sudan had 199 death sentences handed down, 19 executed. Now, this is going to sound really weird. There are actually some countries that will only have blue bubbles. Like, just as an example, Kenya has 21 death sentences handed down, but you will see no red ever. And the reason is they believe in the death penalty, but they don't enforce it. So they believe you did a crime that deserves death. So they'll say you have been sentenced to death, but they don't believe they should kill them. So they just leave them on death row, which is kind of weird, but they actually do that. Now, if you look at some of these other things, like we said, China has more execution than the rest of the world. Afghanistan over here, a lot of those death penalties are based on confessions that are elicited through torture. So that's not a very good deal going on there. Sudan uses the death penalty against opposition activists. So anybody that speaks against them or things like that, they're going to put them to death usually. Okay, so if you look at the totals down here in the bottom, there were 676 executions in 20 countries in 2012. 1,923 people were sentenced to death in 58 countries. So you know the difference between the colors now. And if you look at how we compare to the rest of the world, well, you'll notice we have a few death sentences handed here, but we're the only one on this side of the world that actually executed. But we do, if you looked at size, who are we similar to? Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Vietnam, maybe? Okay. Now my last question is right over here. This is the number of countries carrying out executions from 1991 right here to 2011. What do you see happening as a trend? Yep. Overall, the death penalty, the number of countries carrying out the death penalty is getting smaller and smaller if you look at the big picture. There's a little bit of up and down, but overall it is getting smaller. Okay. Now you ask, what's going on in the United States? Well, you asked me what states do not have the death penalty, and in South Dakota we are surrounded by them actually. The Midwest is the most well-known for being anti-death penalty. Right next to us, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa are anti-death penalty, as well as Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, New York, West Virginia, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and if you look down below here, Washington, D.C. is also anti-death penalty, and New Mexico is death penalty. Now, New Mexico is kind of unique, so let's talk about what we see here. First of all, if you look at the two numbers that are listed, like here, for example, okay, the top number in red are the number on death row as of 2012. The bottom number are the number of executions since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated. Remember, we got rid of it for a while because it was freakishly used, right? So that's why they use those statistics. So for example, in Texas, they have 312 on death row as of 2012, and they have executed 481 since 1976. So if you looked at all of these states, where are the top 3 states? If we were to add the number on death row and executions together, what are the top 3 states, do you think? Yep. Good. Texas, California, and Florida. You're right. Now, here's what I think is interesting. If you look at just those three, notice Texas had 312 on death row, and they've had more executions than they had on death row, right? Now, take a look at California. California has 723 on death row, but they have only executed 13 people. Take a look at Florida. They have over 400 on death row, but they've only executed 73. So what does that tell us about Texas as compared to California and Florida? It could be a number of things. Texas is more pro death penalty, like we need to get it taken care of and taken care of quickly. California probably has more appeals, possibly. So maybe it takes longer for an execution. Maybe they have found that they have been acquitted. In other words, they've been found innocent. Or, I don't know. You know, it's really interesting when you look at that. A lot of people have basically not been executed compared to those that have been sentenced in California and Florida. Now, I told you New Mexico is kind of weird, right? Notice they have nobody on death row in New Mexico because it is an anti-death penalty state. However, they have had one execution. Why is that? Because remember that this is since 1976, and New Mexico has since then eliminated the death penalty. So the execution happened before they actually outlawed the death penalty in their state. And remember that this can switch at any time. If you have a different government, a different leader, a different governor in a state, and they're pro-death penalty, that can change, and all of a sudden you'll flip. Or maybe a major event, maybe a school shooting, for example, may make you want to see the death penalty reinstated. So that changes all the time. Very weird. By the way, also notice Hawaii and Alaska are anti-death penalty as well. Okay, so I want to tell you about the 7 methods most typically used when we talk about the death penalty. The number 1 most commonly used version is hanging, which we don't use a whole lot in the United States anymore. We used to, especially in the cowboy era, but it is used in 78 countries still. Shootings have been used in 86 different countries. Most of them that still use them today were used for war crimes, or they are military courts. So let's say that I am in the Navy and I kill my roommate. In that case, our military has their very own court system that is separate from our civilian population. So they would possibly use shooting. The US is the only country in the world to use these versions. We use the electric chair, poison gas, and lethal injection. And again, depending on the state, which version they use varies. Some states let you choose. The person that's going to be executed can choose which way they want to die. So lots of different variations. Now, what does that say about us? Does it say that we're more concerned about cruel and inhumane punishment? Could be. Maybe electrocution is less lethal than hanging, for example. I don't know. I don't know. After the facts I give you, I'm not sure that you'll believe that. Maybe it's that we have more technology, so we're more apt to use things like electrocution or lethal injection. Other countries don't have access to those things. I don't know. A lot of thoughts. Now, we still have beheadings going on in the world. Those typically are used in 5 countries, and they are ruled by Islamic law. And it is the law in their culture that certain crimes should be used with beheadings. We still have stonings going out, which is horrible. I'll tell you about that. 7 countries use stoning. Most of them are for sexual crimes, but not all have been used in the last 10 years. We still had the Congo and Belgium using the guillotine. Not anymore, but it was used up until, well, somewhat recently. And in Iran, they still can use pushing you off a cliff instead of being crushed to death or beheading. So you can actually choose that as a version. Now, these statistics were put together in 1997, by the way. All right, so now let's get into the details a little bit. Our first area, let's talk about hanging. Hanging is actually a science. It really is, because every person is very different. So let's take a look at what happens. First of all, you are killed by the force of the rope exerted against the body. So here's what happens. They take you up here, okay? And they tie your hands behind your back so that you cannot fight or struggle. And they put a bag over your head or a cloak over your head, and then they put the noose around your neck. And then right underneath your feet right here, there's a trap door, and it opens up, and you fall until the rope stops, and then it jerks the neck. Now, death is brought about by damage to the spinal cord, actually. A lot of people don't realize that. But if that doesn't work, then it would be caused by strangulation or suffocation by cutting off your windpipe or your trachea. Now, if you're doing this the right way, it should end quickly because it's severing the spinal cord, basically. But if you don't drop hard enough and fast enough, then you'll sit there and you'll struggle and you'll suffocate. And you can imagine what that would be like. On the other hand, if you have too much of a jerk at the end of the rope, it can actually take your head off, which is not real pleasant for the viewers. So they don't really like that to happen. And the difficult part is that, like I said, every person is different. The trap door is under the feet, like I said. The length of rope varies depending on how tall the scaffolding is and how tall the person is. The distance of the fall has to be calculated like a trig program or something. It's calculated by the prisoner's weight and height. So the drop for me might be different than one of you little gals in here that weighs 90 pounds, you know, because I'm bigger than you. So they have to kind of figure that out. And like we said, you don't want them to struggle, but you also don't want their head to come off either. So that's very difficult. The goal is to sever the spinal cord without removing the head. Before this modern form, slow strangulation was actually used in Iran and Libya. They wanted them to hang and suffocate. They wanted it to be a little more prolonged. But like we said, in our country, we are guaranteed freedom from being cruel and inhumane. So that would be against our rights. Now I'm going to show you a clip from the movie Nuremberg. And this is where we tried the Nazi war criminals after World War II. And these men, those that were found guilty, were actually sentenced to hanging. So we're going to show you that clip. Now at home, I can't unfortunately show you that because it gets all jumbled and wobbled up. So let me just kind of tell you what you would see. They would take them in one by one. They would allow them to say their last words to the world. The people that get to watch usually are the people that were affected. Could be family of the victims. You can have someone there to look at as part of your family usually, and then any officials that were there. But it's not just like open up to the whole world. They climb the scaffolding, they cover the face after they say their last words, and they drop at the rope. Now in their case, this bottom part is actually covered with wood, which was probably a good thing. I had a student in my class a few years ago, and his grandfather was a guard for the Nazi criminals. And when they did the executions, his job was to carry the bodies away in the coffins. And he had white gloves on as part of his soldier's uniform. And when he got done, his white gloves were soaked red with blood because blood was coming out of the ears and the mouth and the nose of the individuals that were being hung. Okay, so that's basically what you would have seen. And they did it one at a time so that the others didn't see what was coming. Okay. All right, let's talk about shootings. Shootings can be done a couple of different ways. The first one, obviously, is done right in this center picture. It can be carried out by a single shooter, in which case they would actually shoot for the head. This picture, by the way, is very famous from the Vietnam War. because the guy that's doing the shooting was someone from our side. It was a soldier that was working with the United States. And you'll notice the guy he's shooting has his hands tied behind his back. So that means he is a prisoner. And do we shoot prisoners in our army? No, we're not supposed to. So this was in the headlines of the newspaper, and it made us look really bad in Vietnam, that people on our side would do something like that. Okay. So yes, you can do a single shot to the head like this. Or you can use a firing squad that you see here below. And this is typically the military style. There are numerous ways to do it. It can vary between 3, 5 people, whatever. Usually they blindfold the guy or gal. They tie their hands behind or tie them to a post. Now in the official method, they actually put a big target right over the heart. And in a firing squad, they are shooting for the heart. Okay. Then what happens is, and it can be done in different ways, like one group, they will have one guy that has a blank. The rest will have bullets. And that way, when you go home, you can be like, oh, I was the one that had blanks. I didn't kill him. It wasn't me. So it allows the executioner to feel like they're not the killer in some ways. Okay. It can be done that way. Or you can have 3 with blanks and 1 with, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Okay. Now, how are you killed in this case? You are killed by one or a combination of effects: damage to vital organs, central nervous system, or of course, just bleeding out. The point blank method to the head is more immediate. However, the target is smaller. So sometimes you can miss. I mean, if you jerk just a little bit, you can miss your target. Firing squad requires multiple executioners. The death is slower to the heart, even though the target is bigger, which is the torso. So they both have their positives and their drawbacks. Now, the firing squad video that I would show you in this case shows the last guy, it was in the 80s, that chose to be executed by firing squad. I think it was in Utah, if I remember. And so they basically showed you the room. He was actually put in a chair in that case. And his hands were tied down, bag over his head, and then they put a target on his heart. And they shot at his heart, and one of the guys had a blank. All right, let's talk about execution a little bit. Electrocution, or the electric chair, was introduced in the U.S. in 1888 on the grounds that it would be more humane than hanging, because they were seeing that people were struggling with hanging. So they tried this. So here's the process. You secure the prisoner to the chair. You attach moistened copper electrodes to the head and the leg, which have to be shaved so you get a really good contact on the skin. Now you think about why they're doing that. It's kind of like, you know how when you do wiring, you have to have a positive and a negative. You have to have an entrance and an exit. So like if I get electrocuted by lightning, it might come in through my head, but it might go out through my foot. Okay. That's so that the electric current goes through your body from the top to the bottom. That's basically what they're doing. They also, by the way, do put sometimes put a cover over the face, but they definitely put a thing on the head, which has the electric current in it, and stuff like that. Now, here's what they do. They send powerful surges of electric current through the body, and they apply it for brief periods. So they do a little zzz. If that doesn't kill them, then they would do another or another until the person actually dies. Death is caused by cardiac arrest, basically stopping the heart, and respiratory paralysis, so that your lungs aren't breathing anymore. Okay, that's kind of the way that it works. What are the effects? The internal organs are burned. I mean, it sounds gross, but basically what they're doing is they're microwaving a human. So you're cooking them on the inside, okay? Prisoners often leap forward against the straps when the switch is thrown. They may defecate or urinate or vomit blood during that experience. Eyewitnesses always report a smell of burned flesh because obviously you're sending a current through that person. Now, the scene I'm going to show you is from a movie called Carolina Skeletons, and I have it if you want to check it out. It's a really sad story, actually. It's about the George Stinney case. Let me show that to you real quick here. George Stinney was 14 years old. He was the youngest person executed in the United States. And when you see the movie, and this is true of the actual person, he's very small, so he looks like he's about a 10-year-old, which really kind of bothers you when you see it. So Stinney was an African-American young boy from South Carolina. Remember, this is like in the 40s. So we've got separation of blacks and whites. There's a lot of racist stuff going on in the courts down in the South. He was convicted in a 2-hour trial. Tell me what murder trial takes 2 hours, right? He was convicted of first-degree murder of 2 preteen white girls. There was an 11-year-old named Betty and an 8-year-old named Mary. And the story goes that they were walking in the country, and he walked by and they said something to each other like hi, and obviously he was seen saying hello to the girls. Well, they were found dead out in the country there. After being arrested, Stinney confessed to the crime and led investigators to the location where the murder weapon was, and he was electrocuted by electric chair. Since then, there's been a lot of questions about his guilt, the validity of his confession, because he was not given any rights whatsoever. And in fact, in December of 2014, his conviction was actually posthumously vacated. So in other words, 70 years later, they said he was innocent. So he was not guilty. Now in this movie, like I said, you won't see it unless you look it up. You can look it up. But it's a really tough scene. They show this little guy and they show him getting strapped in, and a little friend of his is sitting out in the audience with his dad. He's a white kid, and his dad wanted him to see this kid die, and the kid is begging to leave, which is hard to watch, because they weren't really supposed to be friends, you know. And when the kid struggles, he reaches out, because his hand is so little, the straps are too big, and he reaches out at his friend as he's being jolted with electricity. It's a very difficult scene to watch. All right, and I think that is where we'll stop for today. Thanks for listening.